I now call on Ross Greer to speak to and move Amendment 3858.2.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad to move the amendment in my name. As our Conservative colleagues are ever keen to remind us, we've debated a number of aspects of Brexit in this Parliament in recent months. Just a few weeks ago, members across the Chamber again urged the UK Government to end the uncertainty for citizens of the other 27 EU nations living here in the UK, to not use them as bargaining chips. So it's with some disappointment, but with no surprise whatsoever, that I saw again in today's newspapers that whilst offering positive rhetoric about the contribution our neighbours from elsewhere in Europe have made, the Prime Minister has refused to guarantee their future here. And yes, I absolutely accept that the governments of the other 27 countries should also be offering this reassurance to UK citizens in their nations, and they should be taking them off the negotiating table. But none of that would stop the United Kingdom government from taking EU citizens living here off the negotiating table today. That is entirely a choice of their own making. Our Green colleagues across the continent have been making the case that citizens should not be part of these negotiations, and we will continue to do so. But in the same debates of recent months, we've urged the UK Government again to keep Scotland in the European single market, highlighting the damage that leaving would inflict on our wages, our jobs and the well-being of the Scottish economy. We urged Theresa May to respect the democratic verdict of voters in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and Gibraltar, to agree to a compromise, recognising that we voted to stay. And it shouldn't be forgotten that this was a significant compromise on our part. Scotland did not just vote to stay in the single market. We voted convincingly to stay in the European Union, as stated in the Green Amendment. The proposals set out by the Scottish Government were an exercise in compromise, in damage limitation. They were an attempt at goodwill and cooperation towards their colleagues at Westminster. But frankly, there is very little to show for it beyond empty rhetoric from the other side. I have much sympathy for Mike Russell and the team behind the Scotland's Place in Europe paper. But despite the statements, and after a committee session with the Minister last week, I really have no idea what intensifying the joint work is in regards to these proposals. I have no idea what that actually means, because I've seen nothing from the UK Government that actually explains it. Given that the Prime Minister didn't even wait for the proposals from the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru before outlining her Brexit proposals, I don't have much faith that she's taking any of these compromise proposals seriously. For this reason alone, the Greens cannot support the activation of Article 50. But this is, of course, not the only reason. Across a number of debates, this Parliament has highlighted areas of significant concern, and yet we are no closer to a satisfactory answer on issues raised repeatedly over recent months. The legislation introduced to the UK Parliament is wildly inadequate. It contains barely 2 provisions, one of which simply specifies the name of the bill. As mentioned, the rights of EU migrants are not assured. Amendments in the Commons to this are shamefully set to be voted down by the Government and their backbenchers if they're selected, though for any Conservative MPs watching, there is still the chance of a change of heart. That vote has not come up yet. And the course currently being set at Westminster could not be further from the collective, though not unanimous, position of this Parliament that Scotland remains within the single market, either with the UK as a whole remaining or through a differentiated agreement. It's evident that Theresa May's government does not have a clear plan. What she's laid out so far is confused, it's contradictory, and it's dangerous. And the White Paper would be laughable if it were not so serious. For all the criticisms that the Greens laid out in 2014, the Scotland's Future document was substantial enough for effective scrutiny, and it was scrutinised ahead of the vote. The UK Government's White Paper wasn't even released until after the Article 50 first reading vote in the Commons. Nothing approaching a coherent position was laid out ahead of the referendum itself. Yes.
The definition the UK Parliament has of a White Paper is that it is a policy document produced before legislation. Was it even a White Paper at all?
Ross Greer.
Mr Stevenson is quite right. What the UK Government has published is nothing approaching the definition of a White Paper. It's certainly nothing approaching the definition of satisfactory answers to the huge numbers of questions that not only we have, but the other parliaments and assemblies of this country, of businesses, of citizens across the United Kingdom. We're told that their Brexit plan will protect and strengthen workers' rights. This is the same Conservative government which has just passed the most restrictive trade union bill in living memory. The Brexit minister himself described that bill as fascist in nature and comparable to the dictatorship of General Franco. If the Brexit minister doesn't have faith in his own government's ability to defend workers' rights, why should we? We are told that Theresa May will take a whole UK approach to Brexit, and yet she refuses to work with the Scottish Government on their compromise proposals. We're told that the Brexit negotiations will provide certainty, yet we've heard from European leaders and experts a deep scepticism that a deal can be reached within 2 years, certainly not a deal on our future relationship. And we've seen no plans from the Conservative government to prepare transitionary arrangements. Just last week, before our committee on Europe, Professor Sir David Edward, a former judge of the European Court of Justice, said that if you believe that all of this can be sorted within a few years, you are away with the fairies. Day by day, it becomes clearer that this Brexit plan is being made up on the go by hard-right Tory ideologues. Yes.
Neil Findlay.
Are people away with the fairies when they think that an independent Scotland could be set up in a similar timescale?
Ross Greer.
As I'm sure Mr Finlay is aware, the timescale set up by the Scottish Government in 2014 was something that the Greens were openly sceptical of. We believe in independence, we believe in putting Scotland's future in Scotland's hands, but we disagreed with the Scottish Government on some of the details, and we were clear about that. If Mr Finlay wants to intervene again, he's free to do so. Absolutely.
Neil Findlay.
If the inaccuracy was on his friends on the SNP benches in terms of the timescale it would take for an independent Scotland, what do the magnificent Greens say would be the timescale for that?
Ross Greer.
Unfortunately, without the resources of a government behind us, we estimated it would take a couple of years. We weren't putting a hard timescale on it because at that point, with our 2 MSPs, now with our 6, we're keen to do work on it, but it's no surprise that we're not coming up with a white paper of our own. But anyway, Britain is now hurtling towards a hard Brexit, turning our back on Europe, cozying up to Donald Trump and looking weaker and weaker by the day. So we really must ask ourselves what kind of country we want Scotland to be. This is not only about our EU membership, this is about Scotland's place in the world. Do we want to stick with a country so isolated and in need of allies that holding hands with the bigot in the White House is our best chance of securing a trade deal? Not forgetting that said bigot is also a protectionist whose trade negotiators weren't famed for giving the other side a good deal before his administration came in. Brexit is a monumental change in itself, but it's happening as part of a wider sea change in global politics and in the wake of an economic crisis. To rush into this without anything approaching agreement across these islands, or even a plan for the central government at Westminster, is simply reckless, and it's certainly not in keeping with the verdict that our constituents gave us last June. And in the spirit of Conservative and Labour speeches referencing our own constitutional position and Mr Finlay's intervention, the Greens have been quite clear on our position. During the independence referendum, we were told that Scotland is an equal partner in the Union. That is clearly not the case. It has been confirmed by the Supreme Court that the Sewell Convention is merely a political convention that can be overridden at will, despite promises made in the 2014 referendum. I expect the Chamber today will vote against Article 50 being ratified, but this vote and the vote of the people of Scotland in the EU referendum will be overridden by Westminster. All members in this Chamber must now ask ourselves, where would you rather see Scotland? The time for compromise has almost passed, and we will likely have to choose one future or another.
Come to a close, please.